Hello, friends, and welcome to this week's Midweek message. In this episode, we are looking at Psalm 82. So let's jump right in. Psalm 82 in my Bible, the title is A Plea for a Righteous Judgment, and it's a psalm of Asaph. And like I mentioned last week, Asaph was one of David's primary music leaders, and so there's discussion about whether Asaph actually wrote the psalm or whether David dictated the psalm and Asaph just transcribed it. I tend to think that that's the case, that David was actually the author of this psalm as well. So let's jump right in here. I believe this psalm, more than any of the others that I've read lately, is extremely applicable to our time in our culture. We're about to elect a new president this year and other government officials, other leaders, and this psalm is specifically directed towards the leaders of Israel and of the nations that were around Israel at the time. And so David is basically calling out the lack of spiritual and moral leadership that he sees around him. And so let's look at what David has to say in Psalm 82. He's laying a case against these leaders. He says, God stands in the divine assembly. He pronounces judgment among the gods. And so the picture that David is painting for us here is that of God almost standing in a courtroom, surrounded by the heavenly bodies or the heavenly beings, and he is laying out a case against these defendants, and these defendants are the gods. And notice in your Bible that this is that in this one verse you have a big G God, and then you have little g gods, plural. The little g gods are kings of the earth, and oftentimes when this term is used, it can refer to earthly leaders or kings or people in high positions. Remember that one of the titles of Jesus is the King of Kings. He's a capital K, lowercase k for the kings. He's the Lord of Lords. Capital L for Lord, lowercase l for lords. And it's the same principle. God is the God of gods. God is the big G God, the creator God, the God of the universe. And these little g gods are the rulers of nations and leaders of different people groups. And so God stands in the divine assembly, this courtroom kind of drama unfolding here, and he's pronouncing judgment among the gods. And what is the question that God is asking here? What is the judgment based upon? And that's where verse 2 explains. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? So the problem that God has with all of these kings and world leaders is that they are showing partiality to wicked people, and they are judging unjustly. In other words, they are giving favor to maybe their friends, or maybe they are favoring the rich over the poor. Maybe they are giving preferential treatment to one people group over another. Definitely, we know that they're giving preferential treatment to the rich over the poor, because we're going to look at that in a minute. But he says they're judging unjustly, so they're not being fair. They're not judging the same way across the board. They're granting favors. They're treating different people differently, and he goes on. He says, provide justice for the needy and the fatherless. And so he's kind of asked that question, why are you dealing with people unjustly? And now he's saying, here's my command to you. Here is what you were put in office to accomplish. Here is why I have appointed you to the position that you are in. He says, provide justice for the needy. So this is the reason that government and government officials and government leaders exist, right? To provide justice for the needy and the fatherless, to uphold the rights of the oppressed and the destitute. In other words, to look out for the poor and the powerless, right? And to rescue the poor and the needy and save them from the power of the wicked. So government serves three purposes then. One is to ensure that justice is upheld and that fairness is upheld, to rescue the poor and the needy, to look out for the needs of those who can't really look out for their own needs, and to help those who can't help themselves, and to protect people from wicked people. And so when you think about our current situation in our nation and you think about our government leaders, that's one way to ask the question of, are these people doing the job that God has appointed them to, right? God is sovereign. He's over all. And so he's allowed them to come into these positions of leadership. And so what are these leaders supposed to be doing? They're supposed to be upholding justice, and not just justice for one group of people over another, but justice for everyone fairly, equally across the board. And they're supposed to be rescuing the poor and the needy. In other words, developing initiatives and plans to help those who cannot help themselves. And I'm talking about legitimately cannot help themselves, not people who are just like lazy, but people who legitimately need help and can't help themselves. And they're to protect everyone from wicked. That's one of the reasons that government has been established. And Paul talks about this also in his letters, that, government doesn't carry the sword for no reason. They're there to protect the normal everyday person from wicked people. And so you just have to ask yourself the question, when I watch the news and when I listen to what's going on in the nation right now, how good of a job are our leaders doing in this area? That's why I said this is a very poignant psalm for where we are even in our nation. And he goes on, he says, they do not know or understand, they wander in darkness, all the foundations of the earth are shaken. Now, who is the they that he's referring to? He's referring to the people who these leaders are supposed to be leading. The leaders are supposed to be imparting knowledge and wisdom and developing policies and plans to help people understand the direction that they ought to go. That's what a leader does, is a leader leads. But God is saying that his argument against these leaders is that they are not providing sound guidance, sound counsel. They're not leading people in the right way. Rather, they're leading people into ignorance. He says the people, the they that it's talking about are the people that are supposed to be following. They do not know or understand. They wander in darkness. So rather than providing a direction and providing light to the people that are following them, these leaders are actually the blind leading the blind. They're not acknowledging God. They're not acknowledging his morality. They're not acknowledging truth. They're not acknowledging like the moral law that God has built into the fabric of this created order. And so because they're not doing that, because they're perverting justice, because they're not upholding morality, but instead they're encouraging immorality, and because they're not leading people towards God, they're leading people away, they are causing people to wander in darkness and to subsist in ignorance. And it says because of that, all the foundations of the earth are shaken. Now, what are we talking about here? We're not talking about like the physical foundations of the earth. He's talking about the spiritual foundations, the moral foundations of the earth, the social foundations, the cultural foundations, even the socioeconomic foundations of the earth suffer. Everything that is provides a foundation for culture, for society, for people to live in community. All of that is being eroded and destroyed. And when you think about the shape that our country is in right now, you have to agree that the foundations of our nation are being eroded away because our leaders are just not leading well. He says, and because of that, the people of our nation, they do not know or understand. They're persisting and subsisting in ignorance. I've had conversations with my kids just over the last couple of weeks about some of the stances that people seem to be taking at this time. And we've talked about how illogical some of the stances are. For instance, I was just reading this morning about a senator who was attacked by a mob of people who were coming down on him and yelling things about him, about being racist and about him not upholding justice for people of color. And yet this very senator is the senator who introduced a bill to do away with no-knock warrants, and so his whole purpose was criminal justice reform and making things more fair and just across the board. And so you've got a group of people attacking one of the very people who's trying to help them. And so there's a lot of illogical behavior going on, a lot of mob mentality, people that are doing things that don't make sense, and it's because they are subsisting and they're living in ignorance. They're wandering in darkness. There's no light to guide them because they're not being directed to look to the light of Jesus, to look to the light of God's word, to look to the light of absolute moral truth. We live in a postmodern society, and in postmodernism, one of the number one traits of postmodernism is the absence of absolute truth, but rather a kind of broad consensus that all truth is equal. And the problem with that is that in such a relativistic culture, that means whatever feels right at the time is okay for you to do. And you don't have to look very far to see that is exactly what's being lived out in our world right now. And because of that, everyone is like bumbling around in darkness. They can't see the direction they ought to go because they cannot acknowledge that there's absolute truth. And because they can't acknowledge that, they're just bumbling around and they're all bumping into each other in the dark. And all you're creating is a lot of violence and anger and frustration, and the wickedness just continues to grow. And the foundations of the nation are being eroded. The foundation of the family is being eroded. The foundation of what defines friendships and relationships is being eroded. The foundation of our very Judeo-Christian culture and worldview is being eroded. And so he goes on. And this is where God is going to pronounce judgment now against these leaders who are not doing the job he's given them to do in leading other people. He says, I said, you are gods, little g again. In other words, you're kings, you're rulers. You are all sons of the Most High. And what does he mean by this? What he means is these people were meant to be God's image bearers before other people. They were meant to lead people towards justice and truth and righteousness and fairness. And they were supposed to point people ultimately towards God. He says, however, you will die like humans and fall like any other ruler. And so what he means here is you are all sons of the Most High. You were meant to lead people towards me, but because you are not doing what I called you to do, what I appointed you to do, what I put you into office to do, then you are going to be just like every other human, and you're going to go the way that every other human goes. You're going to die. You're going to fall like any other ruler. You're not going to be remembered. You're going to leave no lasting legacy. There's nothing that you're going to do that's going to be of any value. You're just going to be forgotten, like a vapor, here today and gone tomorrow. Your life will have no meaning. And so then David ends this psalm with this prayer. Rise up, God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you. So it's a reminder that every nation ultimately belongs to God. You can't kick God out of a nation. I've heard people say before that we've kicked God out of schools, and that's why the schools have become so ungodly. Listen, we can't kick God out of anywhere. He owns it all. It all belongs to him. It doesn't matter if we don't want him there or not. We cannot get rid of God. All right. All we can do is turn our backs on him and try to pretend that he's not there and maybe act like he's not there. But that doesn't mean that he's not there. God is sovereign. God is powerful. God is in control. And ultimately, God is going to judge people for the way they live their lives. And I believe that God is going to hold people who are leaders to even a greater judgment, because to whom much is given, much is accounted for. And that's basically what this psalm says, is that our leaders will come under a greater condemnation for their ungodliness than even the ungodly people who follow them, because they're leading people away from God rather than leading them to him. So as I read this psalm the other day, I thought, this is a snapshot. You could take Psalm 82, right? And you could read it. If it were written today, it couldn't be any more practical and applicable to the state of things as it was way back when it was written by David all these years ago. So look, leaders, it is incumbent upon us as people who follow them to make sure that leaders get into positions of leadership who are going to point people in the right direction. And listen, that's where we as believers have a responsibility to do our part in proclaiming the truth and in trying to provide a light in the darkness, and trying to make sure that the right kind of leaders get into place so that they lead people in the right direction. So anyway, I hope this middle of the week word was kind of encouraging to you. I hope it kind of illuminated maybe some things and brought some understanding to perhaps why things are the way they are in the world in which we live. And I hope it gives you some idea of maybe what you need to be doing. If you're a leader, definitely what you need to be doing. And even those of us who aren't necessarily in a governmental leadership role or capacity, what we should be doing even as people who follow. So hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next time.